My name is Lily. I turned 18 earlier this year, and as I write this, I look back at how my life has changed, how everything I once knew turned upside down. I live in California with my parents in a spacious home that we've had for years. Our family, fortunate in many ways, has never struggled. Money was never an issue for us, and we were able to live comfortably. My father, a real estate agent, worked hard to build his career. He's a man of great strength and resilience, with a rugged look that matches his personality. He has always been my role model, and I admired his confidence and determination. Make sure to subscribe to my channel so I can continue bringing you more fascinating true stories like this one. And don't forget to watch this video till the end, because this story is going to be incredibly interesting. My mother, on the other hand, is the heart of our family. She's a kind and gentle teacher who has always put us first. She's patient, caring, and always there when we need her. I never truly appreciated the warmth and love she gave me until much later in life. For years, everything seemed perfect. Our family was well off, and we lived in a cozy home, surrounded by the things we loved. But that peace and security were shattered one fateful afternoon, and everything changed in the blink of an eye. It was a gloomy afternoon, the sky overcast and heavy with dark clouds that seemed to hang over our house like a bad omen. My mother and I were in the kitchen preparing dinner, just as we had done many evenings before. We had gotten used to the simple rhythm of our lives. My father would come home from work, and we'd sit down together for dinner. The kitchen was warm, filled with the comforting smell of my mother's soup cooking on the stove. The wind was cold outside, but inside it felt like home. But then, the phone rang, interrupting the peaceful atmosphere. My mother answered it, and I could hear my father's voice on the other end. The tone of his voice immediately told me that something was wrong. It wasn't his usual confident, steady voice. It was trembling, almost unrecognizable. He told my mother that his company had gone bankrupt, that the money was gone, and that he had no way of paying off the debt. Everything had been lost. He said that we would have to sell the house. Our home, the house where we had spent so many years, where I grew up, was going to be taken away. I stood there, frozen, as my mother's face paled in disbelief. I watched her try to keep calm, but I could see the fear and confusion in her eyes. She asked him what we would do. "Tomorrow, you two must move back to the countryside," my father's voice said, sounding defeated. "Go live with your grandfather. At least there we still have a roof over our heads." His words hit me like a slap in the face. I couldn't understand how everything had changed so suddenly. My father had always been strong, always known how to fix things. But now he was asking us to leave everything behind and start over. The thought of moving to my grandfather's house was terrifying. My grandfather's home was in the countryside, a place I hadn't visited much in recent years. My grandmother had passed away years ago, and since then, my grandfather had lived alone in a run-down house that had grown even more dilapidated over time. My memories of him were filled with love. He had always spoiled me, treated me like I was his greatest treasure. But it had been so long since I'd seen him, and the thought of living with him again was unsettling. I couldn't even remember his face clearly anymore. The next morning, my mother and I packed our things. It was a strange and silent process. My father had disappeared after giving us the news, and I was left to grapple with the reality of what was happening. It was just the two of us in the car as we drove out of the city. The landscape around us changed from the tall buildings and bustling streets to open fields and dirt roads. The air became quieter, emptier, and I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness wash over me. It was as though I was leaving behind everything that had been my life. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were leaving behind our former selves. The house, the city, everything we had known was slipping away, and in its place, there was nothing but the uncertainty of what was to come. When we finally arrived at my grandfather's house, it felt like we were stepping into another world. The house looked the same as I remembered, old and worn down by the years. The roof had faded, and the paint on the walls had peeled away, revealing the old bricks beneath. It was surrounded by a large garden with fruit trees, but even the trees looked neglected, their branches heavy and tangled. I stepped out of the car, hesitant, unsure of what awaited me. It wasn't the warm, inviting home I had once known. The house stood there like a relic from the past, a reminder of everything we had lost. But then the door creaked open, and there he was, my grandfather. He was thinner than I remembered, his back hunched with age. His deep eyes seemed older, wiser, but also distant. When he saw us, he smiled, and for a moment it felt like everything would be okay. He still had that warmth in his smile. But as he looked at me, I noticed something different in his gaze. It wasn't the loving, playful look I had remembered from my childhood. Instead, it was deeper, more intense. He smiled warmly at me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just his age, that time had changed him. But deep down, I knew something was off. We greeted my grandfather, and he led us inside the house. The furniture was simple and old, but it was clear he had tried to make it as comfortable as possible. The house wasn't as luxurious as our old one, but it had its own charm. He had cleaned everything, and he had even prepared a bed for my mother and me. It wasn't ideal, but it was warm. And for the first time since the news of our downfall, I began to feel a slight sense of relief. The first few days were calm. My grandfather would tell us stories about his youth, and my mother began to adjust to the new life. But as the days passed, I began to notice that my grandfather's gaze had become strange. Every time I stood in front of the mirror, combing my hair or brushing my clothes, I felt like someone was watching me. Whenever I turned around, I would catch his eyes on me. It wasn't the look of a loving grandfather anymore. It was something different. His gaze was deep, almost too intense, and it made me uncomfortable. He was no longer the man I remembered. He was someone else, someone who looked at me differently. I tried to dismiss it as a result of the change in my life, thinking it was because I was older now, but it didn't stop. His eyes seemed to follow me everywhere I went, and every time I caught him staring at me, it sent a chill down my spine. But I didn't say anything to my mother. I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, but every time my grandfather was near, I couldn't help the sense of unease that washed over me. Then, one afternoon, when my mother had gone into town, it was just my grandfather and me at the house. I was sitting in the living room reading a book. The sunlight poured in through the window, casting a soft glow on the floor. It was peaceful, or so I thought. My grandfather came in, holding a plate of fruit. It was neatly peeled, apples, pears, and oranges, arranged with care. He placed the plate in front of me and smiled. "You should eat," he said gently. "It's good for your health." I smiled and thanked him, picking up an apple and taking a bite. But as I ate, I couldn't ignore the way he was looking at me. He had sat down in the chair opposite me, his eyes never leaving me. At first I thought he was just sitting there to rest, but the silence grew longer, and I began to feel uneasy. His gaze was steady, almost fixed, and the longer he sat there, the more uncomfortable I became. I tried to focus on my book, but his eyes felt like a weight pressing down on me. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "You've really grown up. Just the other day I was carrying you around in my arms, and now you've become such a beautiful young woman." His words sent a shock through me. I forced a smile, feeling my cheeks flush. "Yes, time flies," I said softly, trying to avoid his gaze, but his eyes didn't leave me. They seemed to burn into me, and I felt a discomfort I couldn't explain. "The older you get," he continued, his voice soft but steady, "the more beautiful you become. You look just like your mother did when she was young. So beautiful, but you also have your own unique beauty. No one else can compare." I didn't know how to respond. The compliments were making me feel uneasy, and I could feel my heart racing. "You flatter me, Grandpa," I said, trying to sound calm, but inside I was becoming more and more uncomfortable. I didn't know how to respond to his words, and they left me feeling confused. He went on, his voice low and filled with something else now. "I used to carry you around the garden when you were little. You were always so chatty. But now, look at you. You've become such a graceful young woman with such a charming figure." I smiled lightly, trying to hide the discomfort I was feeling. "Yes, I remember those days. They were fun," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But his words didn't stop. "You're not just beautiful, Lily," he said, his eyes dark with emotion. "You're also charming. I'm sure the boys would be falling all over themselves for you. I just hope there's someone good enough to take care of you." My heart sank, and I could feel my hands shaking as I turned the pages of my book. His words seemed to hang in the air, and I didn't know how to react. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. All I wanted to do was escape. "You're still young," I finally said, my voice trembling. "It's too early to think about that." Grandpa smiled, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, you're right," he said. "But one day someone will come along. You're so beautiful." With that, he stood up and walked out of the room, leaving me there, shaken and confused. I sat there for a long time, unable to move or think. His words echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort that had settled in my chest. From that moment on, I could no longer look at my grandfather the same way. His eyes, once warm and filled with love, had become something else. They had become filled with desire. Every time he looked at me, I felt like I was being studied, as if he saw me not as his granddaughter, but as something else entirely. The tension between us grew, and I could no longer ignore the way he watched me, the way he spoke to me. I tried to avoid him as much as possible, but I couldn't escape it. Every time I caught his gaze, I felt like I was suffocating. Finally, one morning my mother left again, and it was just my grandfather and me in the house. The silence between us was deafening. He came into the room and stood in front of me, his eyes filled with something darker than I had ever seen before. "Lily," he said, his voice low and full of desire, "I want you." My body froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. "Grandpa," I whispered, my voice trembling, "you can't say that. You're my grandfather." He stepped closer, his voice growing more insistent. "I've thought about this for so long. You're so beautiful, Lily. You've grown into such a perfect woman, and I can't help myself. I want you to be mine." My heart raced as I stepped back, panic flooding my mind. "Grandpa, no, we can't. We can't be like this. Please stop." His face twisted in confusion, and then in something else, something darker. "Why not?" he asked, his voice almost pleading. "I've never loved anyone like this before. You're perfect." "Please," I begged, my voice shaking with fear. "We can't. We're family." He stopped, and for a moment his face softened, as though he realized what he had done. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his voice full of regret. "I shouldn't have said that. I don't know what happened to me." I turned away, my heart pounding. He slowly stepped back, his eyes filled with guilt. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, not knowing what to do. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I just stood there, trembling. Finally, he walked away, leaving me alone in the room. That was the last time I ever spoke to him in the same way. The relationship between us had changed forever. There was an unspoken distance between us now, one that neither of us could cross. I didn't know what to do, but I couldn't stay there any longer. Eventually, my parents were able to stabilize our lives, and we left my grandfather's house behind. I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief because I no longer had to face the growing tension and unease, but sadness because the relationship with my grandfather could never be the same again. As we drove away from the house, I caught one last glimpse of my grandfather standing in the garden. His face was filled with regret and sadness, and I could feel the weight of everything that had happened. But it didn't matter anymore. I had learned a hard lesson. The most important lesson I have learned from this experience is the importance of respecting boundaries, especially in relationships with family. It's vital to trust your feelings and speak up when something feels wrong. Silence can make things worse and lead to long-term emotional harm. If something makes you uncomfortable, it's important to speak out and seek help from those you trust. Always protect yourself and keep relationships based on mutual respect